In 1943, a malnourished grenadier from the Afrika Korps expected starvation, according to Nazi propaganda. The shock was brutally efficient. Pancakes, eggs, and milk in abundance brought more than 50 pounds. While German civilians withered away, he saw the opulence of the enemy's industrial colossus. With each hearty meal, the fallacy of Nazi scarcity disintegrated. Berlin rationed bread and fat. But the grenadier confronted the superiority of a logistics that sustained a global front and fed its enemies. The propaganda of a self-sufficient Reich was crushed by the relentless mathematics of American production, evidenced by abundance and the steel storm on the front. February 1944, Fort Dix prisoner of war camp. The grenadier, now 50 pounds heavier, witnessed the proof every morning. Stacked pancakes, fried eggs, and fresh milk. It was not charity, but the manifestation of a logistics that sustained a global war effort, and paradoxically, its enemies, the incomprehensible abundance. While the grenadier gained weight with pancakes and eggs, Germany, in 1944, faced a food crisis that reduced bread rations to 150 grams daily per civilian. The mathematics of American opulence, with its capacity to dump millions of tons of supplies into any theater of operations, was not only manifest at the prisoners' plentiful table. It translated on the front into the steel storm of artillery, where the Allied rate of fire exceeded German capacity by a ratio of 7-1. This logistical abyss, incomprehensible to the Reich, was the true hell that consumed its divisions. For the grenadier, the steel storm was no longer a distant abstraction from the front. It was the brutal manifestation of the same abundance that filled his plate. Wehrmacht reports, such as those from General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel in 1942, already warned of the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies, which translated into an artillery rate of fire that pulverized defensive positions with incomprehend. While the Reich rationed every last shell, American artillery operated with a logistical disregard that challenged German military doctrine. With each distant explosion, he understood the fallacy of scarcity and the true scale of the industrial colossus. The grenadier's weight gain was not merely a bodily metric. It was the overwhelming weight of an inconvenient truth. With every portion of pancakes and eggs, he devoured the fallacy of a self-sufficient Reich. The American abundance, which fed its enemies with opulence, was the same force that orchestrated the steel storm on the front, dumping thousands of tons of shells. This brutal symmetry between the plentiful table and the artillery hell forced a silent ideological collapse, where faith in his cause disintegrated under the incessant assault of logistical superiority. At Fort Dix, the abundant meal was the poison of abundance, constantly administered. The grenadier watched GMCs unloading supplies that exceeded the capacity of any. He recalled the military rationing, the Ersatzlebensmittel, the scarcity of fat and protein that was wasting away his family back home. Meanwhile, Americans discarded food, a brutal affront to their doctrine of sacrifice and efficiency. Logistical superiority was not just a tactical advantage on the battlefield. It was a psychological weapon of ideological annihilation, operating silently in the minds of the captives. The mathematics of mass production, which allowed such opulence for prisoners of war, was the same force that supplied the front with an overwhelming volume of fire. This truth, indigestible as poison, corroded the foundation of his faith in the Reich. The incomprehensible disparity between the hunger plaguing his nation and the abundance in captivity was irrefutable proof of the fallacy of their cause, an ideological collapse that manifested with every forkful. The grenadier, in turmoil, could not ignore the fallacy. The Wehrmacht operated under intrinsic scarcity, In the winter of 1941, on the Frente Oriental, the Blitzkrieg collapsed not due to bravery, but due to insufficient logistics for its ambitions. Ton miles to supply panzer divisions to Moscow exceeded German rail and road transport capacity. Guderian, in reports, lamented the paralysis of units due to chronic lack of fuel and parts, a consequence of fragmented production and absence of standardization. While EUA produced GMC CCKW trucks at scale, Alemania depended on 2 million horses for transport, a brutal anachronism that strangled its supply lines. Boasted superiority in tanks and artillery was nullified by the inability to keep them in combat. The Wehrmacht never understood that modern warfare was an equation of production and logistics, not tactics or heroism. American abundance, even for captive enemies, proved the undeniable industrial disparity, an abyss that Nazi ideology could never bridge. Logistic failure was the chronic disease of German artillery. Despite the Wehrmacht's, in 1944, on the Frente Occidental, German artillery battalions received fewer than 50 shells per cannon per day, often transported by horse-drawn carts. Ammunition production, fragmented and relying on slave labor, never reached the scale for a war of attrition. OKW reports from 1943 already warned of powder exhaustion and obsolete factories. In captivity, the Grenadier understood that the American Steel Storm, Tunisia, was not an isolated event, but the expression of an industrial capacity that eclipsed total German production. Each bombing raid unleashed millions of tons of steel and explosives, an abundance that made German scarcity a death sentence. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, demanding mobility and rapid attacks, was a confession that Alemania could not afford a war of attrition or artillery. In 1942, in the North African desert, Rommel saw Allied logistics challenge the Wehrmacht. His reports to the OKW warned the Anglo-American capacity to replace losses and sustain offensives was. Rommel warned the enemy's material superiority was systemic, an industrial colossus on an unprecedented scale. In Berlin, the Alto Commando, immersed in dogma, interpreted the warnings as a failure of character, ignoring the industrial disparity. This strategic blindness ignored the production that sustained tactics, condemning the Afrika Korps to annihilation by enemy abundance. While the German prisoner digested the opulence at Fort Dix, the reality on the Western Front in 1944 was a brutal collision of paradigms. The American driver of a GMC CCKW, a mass-produced 2.5-ton vehicle, represented industrial mobility. Every 2.5 minutes, a new GMC rolled off the assembly lines, totaling almost 600,000 units during the war. This colossus on wheels ensured the uninterrupted flow of supplies, from ammunition for the Steel Storm to rations for the soldiers. In contrast, the Wehrmacht, despite its Blitzkrieg doctrine, relied on over 2 million horses for most of its rear area transport. With every kilometer traveled, this anachronistic dependence strangled German supply lines, making logistics an unattainable chimera and tactical superiority an ephemeral illusion. In 1944, the engineering of American abundance solidified in the Red Ball Express, an arterial supply network that defied geography itself and the Reich's doctrine of scarcity. For the Grenadier at Fort Dix, though far from the dusty roads of France, the existence of such a system was a brutal confirmation of the scale of an enemy he was only beginning to comprehend. It wasn't just a fleet of GMC CCKW trucks, vehicles rolling off assembly lines every 2.5 minutes, totaling nearly 600,000 units during the war. The Red Ball Express was a meticulously orchestrated system, a manifestation of the relentless mathematics of production and logistics in its most efficient form. Between August and November 1944, in the European theater of operations, this logistical network operated with an industrial precision. Exclusive roads were designated for Red Ball traffic, with precise military signage and dedicated maintenance crews that ensured the uninterrupted fluidity of the flow. The resupply cadence was a choreography of efficiency. More than 12,500 tons of supplies were delivered daily to the front line, ensuring each American unit the equivalent of 17 kilograms of daily material per man. This infrastructure, a true industrial colossus in motion, was material proof that logistics was not merely tactical support, but the backbone of a strategy of annihilation. While the enemy still relied on horse convoys and fragmented railways, constantly targets of Allied bombings and resistance sabotage, the Red Ball Express transformed distance into an operational irrelevance. The Wehrmacht, trapped in a mindset of rapid war of movement and dependent on captured resources, lacked both the infrastructure and the industrial capacity to replicate such an undertaking. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, in his 1943 reports on the Italian campaign, already expressed frustration with the Allies' unlimited capacity to replace losses and maintain offensive pressure, an indirect testament to the effectiveness of systems like the Red Ball. The storm of steel that devastated German defenses on the Western Front was fueled by the industrial precision of this unbreakable network. Every artillery shell, every gallon of fuel for the Sherman tanks, every bullet for the .50 cal machine guns reached its destination through this arterial network. The numerical superiority of American artillery, which could fire 7 shells for every 1 German, was not just a matter of ammunition production. It was the logistical capacity to deliver that ammunition to the battlefield in volumes that defied German comprehension. The grenadier, observing the abundance of resources, even for prisoners, began to connect the dots. The same capacity that filled his plate was tea. The German doctrine of scarcity, which viewed logistics as a necessary evil rather than a strategic weapon, was exposed as catastrophic short-sightedness. The Red Ball Express was not merely an engineering feat, it was a declaration of power, a demonstration that America operated on a scale of abundance that Germany could never match. The Grenadiers' ideological collapse was not just about pancakes. It was about understanding that modern war was won not by individual bravery, but by the industrial capacity to orchestrate the storm of steel and to feed its own enemies with an opulence that defied reality, proving that his nation's sacrifice was, in fact, a catastrophic error against an industrial colossus of truly incomprehensible scale. The grenadier, whose name was now lost in the statistics of hundreds of thousands, was not an anomaly. Upon returning to a devastated post-war Germany, he was one of thousands of ex-combatants who carried an inconvenient truth inscribed on their own B. The average weight gain of 20 to 30 kilograms, recorded in Allied demobilization reports, was a scar of abundance, a physical testament that directly confronted the narrative of deprivation and sacrifice the Reich had imposed. While German families withered under a severe rationing regime, sawdust bread and moldy potatoes were the norm in 1945. These unexpected messengers from American captivity, however, brought with them stories of fresh pancakes, eggs, milk, ample meat, sugar in profusion, and most incomprehensibly, Coca-Cola. These accounts, often whispered in dark kitchens or in lines for rations, were more corrosive to morale than any strategic bombing. Nazi propaganda had painted an enemy on the brink of economic collapse, a giant with feet of clay, incapable of sustaining a prolonged conflict. Yet, the returned prisoners, with their full faces and robust bodies, were material proof of a monumental ideological illusion. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, in his post-war diaries, would reflect on the catastrophic blindness of German command in understanding the scale of Allied productive capacity, a short-sightedness that extended even to the sustenance of their own captives. The American mathematics of production was not only manifested in the capacity to annihilate Wehrmacht defenses with overwhelming firepower, it was also revealed in the ability to sustain, with opulence, hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war, the same logistical infrastructure that ensured the daily delivery of 12,500 tons of supplies to the front lines via the Red Ball Express was capable of diverting a tiny fraction of its resources to feed its enemies with a diet that far exceeded that of civilians and even many German soldiers on the front. The abundance of food in American prisoner camps was not an isolated act of charity. It was a calculated demonstration of industrial and logistical superiority, an element of psych. The brutal contrast between the reality experienced by the prisoners and the propaganda that had sent them to war generated a profound moral and ideological questioning. The sacrifice of their lives, the deprivation of their families, all seemed to have been in vain against an industrial colossus that could afford to feed its enemies with a generosity that defied reality. Coronel Joachim Peiper, in his captivity memoirs, would describe the shock of seeing American abundance, a shock that led him to question the very foundation of the ideology he had defended. Faith in the Führer, in the invincibility of the Reich, and in Aryan superiority collapsed, not under enemy fire, but under the weight of pancakes and steaks. These ex-soldiers, once imbued with nationalist fervor, unintentionally became agents of ideological disintegration. Their testimonies, however initially met with disbelief or envy, planted the seeds of doubt. American material superiority was not just a matter of tank or aircraft numbers. It was a systemic capacity, a logistical orchestration that permeated every aspect of the war effort, from the steel storm on the front to the dining table of a prisoner camp. Germany, bound by a doctrine of scarcity and dependent on captured resources, could never compete with this scale of abundance. The ideological collapse of the Reich was not just military. It was a forced acceptance that war was, fundamentally, an industrial and logistical competition, and that Germany had catastrophically misjudged its own capacity to compete. July 1944, Normandy. After weeks of brutal stagnation, where the Bocage landscape transformed into a tactical meat grinder, the 1st U.S. Army unleashed Operation Cobra. It was not a victory of individual bravery, but the climax of incessant logistics. A demonstration of industrial power that transcended tactics and became strategy. The objective was simple: to pulverize German defenses on a narrow front and break the stalemate. And the tool for this was an unprecedented storm of steel, a manifestation of the mathematics of production in its most destructive form. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began with an air and artillery barrage that defied any precedent. In just a few hours, over 4,000 tons of bombs and shells were dropped on a front of only 6 kilometers. A volume of fire that turned the landscape into a lunar crater and German defensive positions into indistinguishable rubble. For General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B, the experience was a hell of fire. An area interdiction so complete that resistance became not only futile but physically impossible. The ability to resupply this incessant barrage, guaranteed by the Red Ball Express and the continuous industrial output of the American Colossus, was the true differentiator. while German divisions operated with a fraction of this capacity, often with ammunition rationing and reliance on horse-drawn convoys for supply transport. American units received a rate of fire that seemed inexhaustible. Allied material superiority was not merely numerical, it was systemic. American logistics had evolved into a weapon of mass annihilation, where every shell and every bomb represented a chain of production and transportation that the Wehrmacht could not even conceive, much less replicate. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's most decorated and experienced formations, was virtually annihilated in hours under this logistical assault. It was not due to superior flanking tactics or maneuver, but to the inability to move, reinforce, or even breathe under the weight of artillery and bombings. Von Kluge's reports detailed the disintegration of communication lines, the destruction of vehicles, and the pulverization of troops, making it clear that the division had B. German doctrine, which prioritized troop quality and rapid maneuver, collapsed before an enemy that could simply inundate the battlefield with steel and explosives. The 7-to-1 kill ratio, a brutally efficient statistical datum, was not a coincidence or a measure of individual bravery. It was the mathematics of production in action, the irrefutable proof that the industrial capacity to manufacture, transport, and fire 7 projectiles for every 1 German was the decisive factor. The 2nd Panzer Division, with its Panther and Tiger tanks, individually superior to the Sherman in armor and firepower, was immobilized and destroyed not in tank duels, but under a rain of fragments and fire that prevented any coordinated counterattack. The technical superiority of a German tank was irrelevant if it could not move or communicate, and if it was hit by an overwhelming volume of fire. Operation Cobra revealed the ideological fallacy that had blinded the German command. They had underestimated the abundance that fed prisoners of war pancakes and eggs was the same abundance that poured thousands of tons of explosives onto their comrades. For von Kluge, the experience was a profound shock, forcing him to confront the reality of an enemy that operated on a scale of abundance that defied German military logic. Resistance was futile, because the Allies' replenishment and firepower capacity was, for all practical purposes, infinite. The ideological collapse of the Reich would come not only from starvation at home, but from systematic annihilation on the front, orchestrated by an industrial colossus that transformed logistics into a weapon of mass destruction. The vision of American opulence, which fed their own enemies with pancakes and eggs, was merely the surface of a much deeper and structural disparity. The ideology of the Third Reich, which preached total war and unshakable economic self-sufficiency, was, in reality, a monumental ideological fallacy. While propaganda hammered the image of an industrially invincible Germany, the truth behind the scenes was a patchwork of inefficiency and scarcity, a fragility that the Blitzkrieg tried to mask, but which the war of attrition brutally and efficiently exposed. From the earliest days of the conflict, Germany operated under a doctrine of rapid war, designed to avoid prolonged confrontation that would deplete its limited resources. The dependence on vital raw materials, such as synthetic oil, rubber, and chromium alloys, was a structural weakness intrinsic to its war effort. Without access to vast colonial empires or a natural resource base comparable to that of the Allies, the Reich was forced into an economy of substitution and plunder, an unsustainable long-term strategy. General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, responsible for aircraft production, would lament in his diaries the constant struggle for the last drop of fuel and the last gram of alloy, a testament to the chronic supply cry. While the United States standardized mass production with assembly lines that churned out vehicles and equipment in unprecedented volumes, German industry remained fragmented. Small workshops, often manufacturing incompatible components, were the norm, a remnant of a pre-industrial economy that could not adapt to the scale of modern warfare. This decentralization, though theoretically more resilient to bombings, prevented any optimization of scale and resulted in an ineffective mathematics of production. The ability to produce a Liberty ship in a mere 42 days, or to deliver 600,000 GMC CCKW trucks for the war effort, a volume that alone exceeded Germany's total military vehicle production, was a reflection of an economic organization and productive capacity that the Reich, in its ideological myopia, never understood or replicated. Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments and War Production, detailed in his memoirs the constant struggle against the lack of raw materials and slave labor, though abundant, did not compensate for the inherent inefficiency of a system that prioritized ideological control over industrial efficiency. Tank production, for example, despite being technologically advanced in models like the Panther and the Tiger, was chronically low. In 1944, Germany produced fewer than 1,500 tanks per month, while the Western Allies exceeded that mark by more than 3 times, not counting Soviet production. The direct practical consequence of this industrial failure was the inability to sustain any steel storm comparable to that unleashed by the Allies in Operation Cobra. The German doctrine of scarcity, which viewed logistics as a necessary evil rather than a strategic weapon, proved to be a catastrophic blindness. Every artillery shell fired by the Allies represented a production and transport chain that Germany could not even conceive, let alone replicate. The numerical superiority of American artillery, which could fire 7 shells forever, the American industrial colossus, was not an accident of history. It was the consequence of an economic organization intrinsically linked to an abundance of resources and a mentality of optimization and standardization. The ability to feed its enemies with opulence, to build fleets of ships and trucks in record time, and to drop thousands of tons of explosives on enemy defenses, all emanated from the same source, a mathematics of production that Germany, trapped in its own rhetoric of self-sufficiency and superiority, could never match. The German total war was a myth, shattered by the relentless reality of logistics and the industrial capacity of an enemy of truly incomprehensible scale. The ideological blindness that obscured the vision of the grenadier in his American captivity, promising starvation and finding pancakes, was an amplified reflection of the myopia that afflicted the German High Command itself. The propaganda that fueled the belief in the Reich's self-sufficiency and the superiority of its military doctrine clashed head-on with the relentless reality of Allied logistics, a truth that for the more perceptive generals began to manifest in diaries and reports with profound and growing shock. February 1943, Eastern Front. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg and one of the Wehrmacht's most brilliant armored strategists, recorded in his notes the paralysis of his armored divisions. It wasn't the Soviet enemy that held them back, but the chronic absence of fuel. While his tanks, many of them technologically superior, remained immobilized due to lack of gasoline, he observed with consternation the enemy's ability to operate with an abundance that defied the German logic of scarcity. For every ton-mile the Wehrmacht failed to deliver, the Allies moved hundreds, a disparity that Guderian, in his pragmatic military analysis, could not ignore. The doctrine. Already in 1942, from the North African desert, General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, sent alarming reports to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. OKW. He warned about the overwhelming material superiority of Allied forces and, more disturbingly, about the Allied ability to replace losses at an incomprehensible rate. Rommel, a master of maneuver and improvisation, saw his units constantly outmatched in numbers of tanks, aircraft, and supplies, and realized that every Allied loss was quickly replaced, while every destroyed German tank was an almost irremediable loss. The mathematics of production, which he could not quantify in detail, was felt by his troops, who faced an enemy that seemed to have an inexhaustible well of resources. The transition from ideological blindness to the bitter acceptance of the inevitable fact would culminate in post-war interrogations. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and responsible for the war economy, admitted that in testimony that dismantled the Reich's own rhetoric of invincibility, Göring acknowledged that logistics was the true strategy. This statement, coming from one of the pillars of the Nazi regime, was the final proof that modern warfare was not won by individual bravery or isolated tactical genius, but by an equation of production and logistics that Germany never managed to solve. The storm of steel that annihilated German defenses in Normandy, the abundance that fed prisoners of war with pancakes and eggs, and the paralysis of Guderian's armored divisions were all manifestations of the same relentless mathematics of production, which German generals, through bitter experience, were forced to confront. Superiority did not reside merely in an individual tank or airplane, but in the systemic capacity to produce and deliver on a scale that the American industrial colossus mastered. The ideological collapse of the Reich was not just military, it was a forced acceptance that war was. The bitter acceptance of the truth by German generals did not fully reveal the operational abyss that separated belligerents. The storm of steel and the opulence for prisoners were not isolated miracles, but the manifestation of meticulously planned logistics. The American Advanced Supply System. February 1945, in the Rhineland. General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commander of Army Group H, observed with despair the American capacity to sustain continuous offensives. Behind Allied lines, vast advanced supply depots, advanced depots were established with a speed and scale that defied German comprehension. These logistical complexes, true supply cities, were filled with millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations, pre-positioned for the incessant advance. The American operational paradigm was logistical push, ensuring supplies were available before demand was formalized. Instead of waiting for requisitions from the front, the German pull system, which depended on a fragment. This ability to pre-position and move supplies allowed American artillery units to maintain barrages for days on end, while German units exhausted their ammunition in hours. The contrast was brutally effective. The resupply speed of an American division was measured in hours, for a German one, in days or, frequently, weeks. German intelligence reports detailed frustration with the Allies' unlimited capacity to maintain offensive pressure, failing to understand the mathematics behind that uninterrupted flow. For every ton-mile that the Wehrmacht struggled to move with its horse convoys and bombed railways, the American system moved hundreds, ensuring that every artillery shell, every gallon of fuel for the Shermans, and every ration was in the right place at the right time. This was the technical manifestation of the mathematics of production, transforming tactical support logistics into a strategic weapon. The abundance that fed prisoners pancakes and eggs was the same that ensued. In 1945, demobilized grenadiers returned to a devastated Germany. Their weight gain, 20 to 30 kilograms, contrasted brutally with the local misery where families wasted away under rationing. The soldiers' stories of pancakes eggs, and Coca-Cola unmask the Reich's fallacy, their full faces revealing the lie of enemy scarcity and the scale of the American industrial colossus. In Nuremberg and in memoirs, figures like Goering and Guderian, previously blinded by ideology, admitted the truth. Their testimonies revealed that defeat was not due to bravery or strategy, but to the mathematics of Allied production and logistics. The capacity that fed prisoners generated a storm of steel, annihilating defenses. This acceptance sealed the Reich's ideological collapse, dismantling its illusions of grandeur. The acceptance of reality solidified the lesson: connection beats platform. Although the German Panther was an engineering marvel and a powerhouse of firepower, its effectiveness was superseded. Logistics ascended from tactical support to fundamental strategy, evident to Germans with tanks immobilized due to lack of fuel. The truth of logistics, evident in German tanks immobilized due to lack of fuel, found verification in the post-war period. The Marshall Plan, more than $13 billion for a devastated Europe, including Germany, demonstrated that the American industrial colossus not only destroyed, but regenerated and built, offering hope and recovery. Abundance, once a weapon of war, transformed into an instrument of diplomacy and cooperation. For the Germans, the scale of resources for such reconstruction was irrefutable proof of logistical and productive superiority, redefining the European future. The experience of World War II, where American abundance was the ultimate weapon, forged the logistical doctrine of the Cold War. The industrial colossus, understood in its capacity and scale, prepared to sustain a global confrontation, with resilient supply chains and mass. For Germany, which internalized this lesson, logistics remained at the epicenter of global power strategy, the legacy of the mathematics of production and military and economic power.